Welcome to my weekly meta review for Standard, where I go over the best of one and best of three decks that caught my attention every week. And we've got some really cool ones this week. So still no budget lists. I do look for budget decks that are doing reasonably well. And right now, it's kind of difficult, right? So I'm working on redoing my budget deck list for beginners. But it's not quite at a point where I feel really good about it. But this week we're going to be looking at some best of three lists. So nothing that caught my attention from just the best of three or best of one ladder and climbing to Mythic. But we had some really cool ones from the tournaments. So we're going to start things off with the Bant Poison deck, which is this one's been floating around for a little bit. Toxic used to be Celestia or green white. And then we saw for a moment there was we were exploring the Simic Toxic space with Venerated Rot Priest. And so this is kind of a blend between the two, and it's primarily Azorius or blue-white, and splashing the green for Venerated Rot Priest. And so the idea here is, so you've got the early Toxic creatures that, you're trying to get to 3 Toxic specifically, gives you Corrupted, which turns on and makes some of your spells better in your deck. And then if you get your opponent to 10 Toxic, you just win. So this is kind of like a 2/1 creature that when it dies, it creates another 2/1 creature. When you look at that, then you can see why it's really strong if you are doing the Toxic theme. So not only is it annoying to remove, but yeah, your opponent has to figure out how to block this, or it can be a very quick clock. Similarly, like Jawbone Duelist, every time that you deal damage, you give them a Toxic counter. So if you have Double Strike, it gives them 2 Toxic counters. And then Annex Sentry is kind of like the Cathar. It can remove something that's an artifact or creature that is mana value 3 or less until it leaves the battlefield. It also has Toxic. And then we've got Skrelv, which has Toxic, but you can give a creature Toxic 1s and they stack. So if you give a Crawling Chorus Toxic 1, it already has Toxic 1, so it hits for 2 counters. If you give Jawbone Duelist Toxic 1, then it hits for 4 because it deals 2 Toxic counters every time it deals damage. So giving Skrelv, you not only are you protecting your Toxic creatures from point removal, but you're also able to make it so that they can't be blocked by that color. So if you're up against a mono white deck, for example, then you can give them hexproof from mono white, and then mono white creatures can't block them, and you can just push in a lot of really early damage. The payoffs after that too, Bring the Ending, for example, is a quench that counters target spell unless its controller pays 2. If your opponent is corrupted, which is that 3 poison counters, then that spell is just countered straight up for 1 and a blue, which is a very powerful counterspell. Experimental Augury is a way to dig through your deck, and also trigger Proliferate. So because they are counters on your opponent, anytime that you proliferate, you're going to add an additional counter to one that's already there. And so this is a way to dig through your deck while also increasing the amount of poison counters that are on your opponent. Similarly, the Serum Snare bounces an opponent. If that opponent had mana value 3 or less, then you trigger a Proliferate and you get another poison counter. And then the payoff here for getting them to Corrupted, which is 3 poison counters, you then trigger Skrell's Hive, which gives all of the creatures you control Toxic. They now have lifelink. And so not only are you hitting for an incredible amount of damage in Toxic, but you can also be stabilizing against the race, which is really handy against mono red. And it spawns a 1/1 during your upkeep, so it also goes wide. So a lot of these, Crawling Chorus being replaced by a 1/1 Might, the ability to create 1/1 Mights through Mirrex. There is a little bit of this, let's just flood the board, because if you attack with 5 Toxic creatures and they only have 3 blockers, you're going to get that 2 Toxic through, right? So it can be really handy for pushing through your late damage. And that's what Charge of the Mights is particularly nice for, is either really nice spot removal for going wide, because it can deal damage equal to the number of creatures you control, or you can create 2 more Might creature tokens with Toxic that go wide. Now, the reason why we're splashing green is for Venerated Rot Priest, and Venerated Rot Priest is a combo. specifically with March of Swirling Mist. So whenever a creature you control becomes the target of a spell, target opponent gets a poison counter. And when we were running the like Celestia or the Simic versions, you could pair this with Hexproof so that if your opponent targeted your Rot Priest, then you could give it Hexproof, and so that it would prevent that damage and or prevent that spell, and then your opponent would get 2 poison counters. But really where it really shines is with March of Swirling Mist, and this is because you can target your own creatures. So if you have 2 Venerated Rot Priests in play, these do stack. So every time that a creature you control becomes targeted by a spell, your opponent gets 2 poison counters. So if you have 5 creatures in play and you phase them all out with March of Swirling Mist, that's just 10 poison damage right off the bat. And because of the early pressure of this deck, your opponent usually has 3 or 4 poison counters already. So you only need 3 to really... 3 creatures and 2 of them being Venerated Rot Priests to make this just like a game-winning card. And so that was part of the Simic Toxic strategy, was to lean onto this combo. And so you kind of like, we're throwing it all together, and I love to see it. And then we've got some Fading Hopes, which is really nice for either slowing down your opponent's plays or just bouncing your own thing, right? Because if you have, like, you know, they go to remove your Annex Sentry, you can bounce it, and then if you have a Venerated Rot Priest in play, not only do you get your Annex Sentry back to remove something that your opponent has, but you also give them a poison counter. You can use it to save your own Venerated Rot Priests, etc. So I've played this deck in its parts. I've never seen it assembled quite like this. So I thought this was really exciting. And this deck won first place in the Standard Challenge 32 on January 6th, and second place with a list that had very similar cards, but kind of a different distribution between what was in the main and what was in the sideboard. They won second place. Anders T won second place on the 7th. And so as far as the lands go, there are some specific rares that are a little bit like March of Swirling Mist doesn't see a lot of play in other decks, right? Like the Seed Core. There's some unique rares to this deck, so it might be a little bit of an investment if you are new to Magic the Gathering. But Seed Core, if you have the Corrupted, it makes it so you can turn your Jawbone Duelist or your Crawling Chorus or anything getting through. You can give it +2/+1 and at instant speed. Which is the really nice part. So it kind of helps you push damage, which if the poison isn't looking like it's going to win, this deck can win through damage as well, which is the advantage to the Toxic strategy in the first place. And then Mirix is nice against control and board wipes. You often see Mirix at least 1 copy or 2 copies in a lot of decks, just because it does give you kind of some late game inevitability, where if it does get very late, you can just start creating these 1/1s, like when you and your opponent are top decking. And then as far as the lands go, it's just kind of fixing for playing 3 colors. So you see a lot of the rare lands that help smooth your mana base, which you can't go wrong crafting those, right? And then we've got Otawara, Soaring City, and Aganja, which are the legendary lands. Also, crafting one of these, 1 copy, is generally worth doing because they see a lot of play. As far as the sideboard goes, we've got 2 Destroy Evils, which has been pretty standard for if your opponent has useful enchantments like Wedding Announcement and the Virtue of Loyalty in white in Esper Midrange. The 3 copies of Negate are really nice if you come up against Azorius Control or anything that is a relatively spell-heavy list and not a creature-heavy list. 1 more copy of Charge of the Mites. If they are running a very creature-heavy list, you can bring that in over like Fading Hope or Knockout Blow is specifically for against mono red. You're going to want to bring this in to protect against the mono red. It's one of the reasons why mono red isn't a really great option in best of 3, because of the sideboard, right? So you bring this in, it's a 1-cost spell if it's targeting a red creature, and you deal 4 damage to attacking or blocking creature, and you gain 2 life. So really great way to stabilize and remove your opponent's threats if it's against mono red. Another copy of Skrelv's Hive, and this one you're going to want to bring in if you have if it's more of a mid-range thing, because the fact that you constantly make a 1/1, it's kind of like Wedding Announcement. the more that you expect the game to be going longer, the better that you're going to want to be bringing in the hive, because you do lose 1 life every time that you create the 1/1. So against an aggro deck, it can be really you can be pressured too quickly to where this is killing you instead of stabilizing you with the lifelink that you get only if you get to Corrupted 3. So Disdainful Stroke is nice against the domain decks, any of the domain deck specifically to block Sunfall from wiping your board full of toxic creatures, but also useful for blocking some of their larger spells like Atali or Breach the Multiverse. So anything that you see like that's leaning towards let's ramp to big spells, it's good to bring in the Disdainful Stroke. And then we've got the 2 more copies of Annex Sentry. And so this was another one that if you're playing against a really creature-heavy deck and there's not a lot of spells like Azorius Soldiers, then you would bring in the Annex Sentries and you would bring in the other Charge of the Mites. And kind of, I haven't played the deck well enough to know exactly what you would be sideboarding out. But, you know, against a creature-heavy deck that doesn't have a lot of removal, I think I would be taking out the Fading Hopes just as a place to start. So... All right, next up on the list is Rakdos Midrange by Sokos13. Took down 3rd place in the Standard Challenge 32 on January 6th. And this one's not a new archetype, but we have seen some changes. So if we go back to week 6 of Lost Caverns of Ixalan, which I think was 3 weeks ago, we can see a couple of tweaks. So we're down 1 copy of Gix Yawgmoth Praetor, which I think, you know, works really well with the bat, but when you miss the bat, then it's a little bit less impressive. And we're running 1 more copy of Akalot's Deepest Betrayal in the main. And I think if I remember correctly, this was in the sideboard. It might have been just in a Golgari deck. It's, you know, when you cover this many decks, they all start to blur. But Akalot's Deepest Betrayal is a really nice mid-range threat. The fact that it attacks your opponent's hand is nice against control. And then the fact that if they don't exile it, it just keeps coming back is fantastic, right? So this is one of the things that you're going to kind of tutor for with the Cruelty of Gix. So the Cruelty of Gix allows you to target your opponent's hand, remove a Planeswalker, which is really nice against Azorius control, and then search your library for a card, put it into your hand. And then the third one is put target creature card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. So you get a little bit of this kind of like reanimation, which is really nice if they, you know, you play a Trumpeting Carnosaur, they kill the Trumpeting Carnosaur, you just bring it back. So, this one, I've actually seen this starting to pop up in Best of 1, which is interesting because it is more of a Best of 3 deck than it is a Best of 1 deck. And but it is really nice against control. You've got the Liliana of the Veil, which I've lost to. So when I just yesterday I played the 6 hours of 50 matches of Azorius Control, the mill deck. And Liliana of the Veil is kind of a problem for that deck because all of those wraths are not targeting planeswalkers. So Get Lost is like the only tool that you have against this deck, and you know and there's lots of targets that you need to hit with your Get Losts between the Cruelty of Gix and Liliana of the Veil. So you know, the part that's really nice about Lily is being able to make your opponent discard a card because you don't care about getting hellbent in this deck. And control deck definitely does care about losing their entire hand. So they've cut the 1 copy of Extract the Truth, which was the kind of enchantment specific hate. So I think this change is saying like we're starting to see less Esper Midrange. So we're going to put the enchantment hate into the sideboard instead of into the main. Cut the 1 copy of Bonehorde Dracosaur, which I think was a good call because like between Akalot's Deepest Betrayal and Trumpeting Carnosaur, when I've played against the Rakdos Midrange deck, I haven't really felt like I'm scared when my opponent plays the Bonehorde Dracosaur. It's amazing in limited where you you just outvalue your opponent, and it's certainly like a good inclusion if you don't have the Akalot's Deepest Betrayal, right? But I do agree with cutting that one. I think there's better threats that you can find with your Gix's command. And then they tweaked the lands a little bit. They decided to go up 1 more copy of the Black Cleave Cliffs, which is the Rakdos fast land. It comes into the battlefield tapped if you control 2 or fewer other lands. As far as the sideboard goes, we've got the cut downs, which is good against the like creature specific decks, the more aggro, of a curve that you're facing up against, the more targets that you can actually hit with cut down, you're going to want to bring those in. Got 2 copies of Duress, which is really nice for even more targeted hate against the Azorius control matchup. And then we've got Anoint with Affliction, which is really nice for recurring threats that need to be exiled, like Mosswood Dread Knight in Golgari. 2 more copies of Lilion the Veil if we really want to pump, if we're playing against something like the Azorius control that has a bunch of board wipes, but not a lot of specific Planeswalker hate, then the Lilion of the Veil can come in. Breach the Multiverse is an alternative win condition if you're feeling like you need to go a little bit taller than your opponent. And if you're new to Magic, what that means is, let's say that your win condition is a Tali, or your win condition in this deck is like Trumpet and Carnosaur, and in game 1 you go up against somebody and they're doing the same thing you are, but just slightly bigger, right? So then you would need to bring in the Breach the Multiverse to go a little bit over the top of them. That's what I mean by taller. And then we've got Extract the Truth, which was the 1 copy that was in the main. Now we've got 2 copies in the sideboard. And I like this in the sideboard more than I do in the main, unless you're really anticipating coming up against Esper Midrange. I think it's better to wait until you see your opponent have specifically enchantments, because removing an enchantment or a planeswalker from your opponent's hand is like, or creature, is kind of expensive and can whiff if your opponent is, playing the wrong thing, right? A Braid for some specific artifact hate, so you're going to want to bring this in if you're up against one of the Azorius artifact lists, which is one of the new brews that I covered a couple of weeks ago. If you don't know that one, I think it's worth checking out. It's doing some cool stuff. They've got the Brotherhood's End, which is a good wrath for any of the board-centric strategies like Azorius Soldiers, and then Gix's Command, similarly, really good against the board-centric. But it also gives you kind of an alternative for outvaluing your mid-range opponents, which is the nice thing about Gix's Command, is that it has that flexibility. And because you can you can return 2 creatures from your graveyard to your hand, give you some dig, as well as you can use it as targeted removal or a wrath or some stabilization against aggro with the lifelink. So I'm a big fan of Gix's Command, and I'd probably try to figure out a way to get 1 copy into the main, just because I really like it. But that's because I'm a dirty best of 1 player. Third up on the list here is Mono Red Aggro by Mercies, and we covered a list by them not too long ago, but actually it's been long enough that I think it's worth revisiting. So they took down first place in the Standard Challenge 64 on January 7th, and if we go back and we compare the list, which I believe was by Mercies in the first place, in week 4 of Lost Caverns of Ixalan, so 5 weeks ago, there has been very little change. And so one copy of Charming Scoundrel from 2, which works nicely with triggering Godric and the Celebration. And generally, I just like this card more than the Bloodthirsty Adversaries that we see a lot in the best of 1 lists. And down 1 copy of Mishra's Foundry from 4. So leaning a little bit more creature centric, a little bit less land. Little bit higher variance on not hitting 4, but you don't need to hit 4 with this deck, right? So I think I like that change. And the best of 3 sideboard for this deck, if you haven't seen this deck already, this is the cleanest best of 3 sideboard ever. So it's got 4 copies of Lithomantic Barrage, which deals 5 damage if the target is white or blue. So you bring that in if you're up against white or blue players. Urbrask's Forge, which is another one that you can bring this in if you're struggling against a control deck, something that doesn't have a lot of artifact hate. This allows you to push. This gives you inevitability, because every single turn the X1 is just getting bigger and bigger and bigger until it's something that your opponent can't handle. So if you're feeling like all of your stuff just keeps getting answered and they've got really good point removal, you can bring in the Urbrask Forge. And then we've got In the Festivities, which deals 1 damage to your opponent in each planeswalker that they control. So this one's really good for if you're up against the Azorius Tokens deck or Azorius Soldiers, any of the board-centric strategies, running the In the Festivities over the Brotherhood End, because you have a smaller mana curve. And then we've got Furnace Punisher, which if you're up against any deck that doesn't run basic lands, which is basically any 3-color or more deck, has to lean heavily on the rare lands to be able to get their mana base to work. And if you come up against that, then you can really punish them with the Furnace Punisher. And next up on the list is a new archetype as well, at least a new archetype to me. It's 4-Color Legends by CFT SOC 3. And this one won second place on Standard Challenge on Standard Challenge 64 on January 7th. And so we've seen this deck before, kind of, where there used to be like a legendary specific 4-color, 5-color Legends deck that leaned heavily on getting the power boost to legendary creatures in red-green, if I remember correctly. Been a while since we've seen that one. But this one is leaning heavily into the legendary synergies. So like Relic of Legends allows you to tap an untapped legendary creature you control and add 1 mana of any color, as well as being a mana fixer in and of itself. So there's kind of like a little bit of this ramp aspect to it. But you're also leaning heavily into the Rona and Inti, Cynical of the Sun, are both legendary creatures that allow you to draw a card and then discard a card in some fashion. And what's nice about this is you can combine it with Slogurk, which whenever a land is put into a graveyard from anywhere, like discarding it, you can put a +1/+1 counter on Slogurk the Overslime. Then you can remove 3 +1/+1 counters from Slogurk and return it to its owner's hand. And then when it leaves the battlefield, you return up to 3 target land cards from your graveyard to your hand. And even though it is running Titania, Voice of Gaia, they decided not to go for the meld, which I thought was kind of interesting. So no Argoth, Sanctum of Nature, but you're still, whenever you're putting a land into your graveyard, you're gaining 2 life. So Titania, Voice of Gaia is a really great way to stabilize against the aggro. And then there is a little bit of the land loop with Slogurk, right? So like you could like mill into your Argoth and then bring it back, the Argoth from your graveyard, into your hand with Slogurk. So there, you could do the meld thing if you wanted to, but they decided not to do that, partially because I think melding Titania is a little bit more of a meme than it is actually a competitively good option. But then the point of bringing back your lands, there is still a payoff to doing that. The legendary lands, though, you can, the ones that you discard, so like the Sokenzan, Takanuma, and Boseiju, these are lands in Otawara, like you can tell that they're leaning heavily into the legendary lands, and there's even one in the Boseiju down here in the sideboard. But so you're looping these lands that allow you to channel and then do it again, bring them back over and over, which I thought was kind of cool because we don't really see the legendary lands getting leaned into that heavily in other archetypes. We've got some like Urtai Resurrected and Jace for some interaction, as well as continuing to have more legendary creatures. We've got Glissa Sunslayer, which is an amazing legendary creature that's, usually at home in Golgari, but is making an appearance here. Ludwig Necrogenius, whenever it attacks, you mill a card, which helps with the general land mill strategy. And then you can exile X creature cards from your graveyard to transform Ludwig, and then this creature transforms into a copy of a creature card that was exiled, except for it's a 4/4 and it's a blue zombie, and then you put a number of +1/+1 counters on it equal to the number of cards exiled with it. So this is another like little one-of-mill payoff. And then for your incredible amount of lands and ramp, you've got a payoff here, 1 copy of Goose Mom, or the Goose Mother, which comes down as a 2/2 flyer with X +1/+1 counters on it, and then you create X, half of those X food tokens rounded up, and then when it attacks, you may sacrifice a food to draw a card. So kind of really great late game threat from Wild's Veldrain. 1 copy of Cut Down, which I'm always surprised whenever I see these like 1 copies of, right? Like why wasn't this just a 4th copy of Go for the Throat? But anyway, 1 copy of Cut Down, and lastly, Ashnod Flesh Mechanist, which is a 1/1 death touch. Whenever it attacks, you may sacrifice another creature. If you do, create a tapped Power Stone, and then you can exile a creature card from your graveyard to create a 3/3 colorless zombie artifact creature token, which is another payoff for milling creatures into your deck or discarding creatures with Rona and Inti. So really curious to see how this deck performs, and it's doing some really cool stuff. As far as the best of 3 sideboard goes, we've got 2 more copies of Cutdown if you're coming up against an aggro deck, Duress if you're coming up against the spell heavy decks, another copy of Jace, Gix's Command, this is partly why, like, for covering the best of 3 sideboards, like, I was skipping it initially, is that, like, there's a lot of repetition once you get used to the best of 3 sideboards. But in case this is your first, like, time seeing my video, or the first time, like, really diving into the meta, you've been gone for a while and you need to know what's going on, right? I've got to do it every single week. Kix's Command is really great because you can wrath your opponent's board, put +1/+1 counters on lifelink. It's just got a lot of really good versatility. Pilfer, your opponent chooses this is like targeted hand hate, and so not one that you typically see a lot in your sideboard. Usually there's more of like 4 copies of Duress, for example, instead of 2 copies of Pilfer. This allows you to hit creatures, though, and any non-land card. So maybe they want to bring this in against like control decks, get rid of Sunfall in the hand and such. 3rd copy of Titania, Voice of Gaia, which I think is to bring in against aggro decks so that you can stabilize off of the gain 2 life. Another copy of Jace the Perfected. If you need an alternative win condition, maybe the Jaces are pretty good for stabilizing against early aggression, as well as giving you an alternative win condition. And but I think we're doing a lot of self-mill more than we are actually trying to mill our opponent. So Jace might also be a good enabler, whereas like Inti and Rona are going to be kind of slow to get started. Jace can target yourself. So as long as you're not up against Azorius control where you're going to like lose to self-mill, that might also be a good reason to bring in Jace. Sheoldred the Apocalypse, a one of, excellent legendary creature. Interesting to see that like it's not just included as a one of in the main. But everybody, Shelly gets a lot of targeted hate because Shelly is a very good card. Urtai Resurrected, which is another point removal that kind of combines nicely with Sheoldred. So you could bring in, I imagine if you bring in Shelly, you're going to bump up Urtai Resurrected to 3. And then we've got Atali Primal Conqueror, which is kind of another late game kind of similar to running a Breach of the Multiverse. Gives you a way to go taller than your opponent. And also, if your opponent is playing Atraxa or Breach, if you're playing against like these decks that have a high payoff, Atali's nice. The better that you're likely to hit something good and juicy from your opponent, right? So like I think I'd really look to bring in Atali against like Domain Ramp. And then we've got one more copy of Boseiju, Who Endures, which is the come on, let me get down there. Let me. It's not letting me do it. Over here, I'll show you over here. It's the one that specifically artifact or enchantment hate against your opponent. So the more that you're against like Azorius artifacts or Esper Midrange with their white enchantments, then you're going to want to bring in another copy of Boseiju. Another one that I wanted to revisit is Esper Midrange, and Esper Midrange by Misplaced Ginger got 3rd place in the Standard Challenge on January 7th. And if we compare this to 2 weeks ago and week 7 of Lost Caverns of Ixalan, we've seen a couple of changes, nothing crazy. So we've got 1 copy of Tishana's Timebinder making its way into the main. I've really liked this card, and I think that it has some really interesting targets. So in lieu of this, we're taking out 1 Make Disappear, which Make Disappear still works, even though Cavern of Souls is in the meta. A lot of the meta is still very spell heavy, right? I actually don't think that the Cavern of Souls has made counter spells as bad as like we all thought maybe it would. But Make Disappear is nice for getting rid of Sunfalls and such, right? Still good against non-creature spells, even if they have Caverns. But we're going down for one down on Make Disappear for some more specific triggered abilities and activated abilities hate. So I thought that was kind of an interesting inclusion. And then this one is running 1 copy of Aganjo, Seed of the Empire, which I thought was originally in the Esper list. Last week I thought there was an Aganjo and there wasn't, so I'm happy to see Aganjo into the main. I do think that it's pretty good at removing your opponent's stuff, and targeting maybe a Rafine is particularly nice in the mirror. You do have to pay for the ward, but I think that's a pretty good one to have, and happy to see it. And in lieu of the for the inclusion of one Iganjo, we're going down one Underground River, which is the blue-black land that deals 1 damage. So not a whole lot of changes going on there, but still some interesting ones. And if you're completely new to the archetype, I recommend going back and looking at the one that I covered in week 7. I think I go a little bit better into what's going on. Very briefly, though, you're looking to destabilize your opponent through like Deep Cavern Bat, and then win through Rafine. And if you have a Rafine and a Shieldred, or Rafine and Gix, there's ways that you can just like loop a huge. So Connive triggers a bunch of draws, and the draws can give you a bunch of life with Shelly, or deal a whole bunch of damage. And not only that, but just like you have some really good just mid-range threats, and the Connive doesn't need Shieldred to work to just overpower your opponent. And then, yeah, just a bunch of disruption, point removal, go for the throat, cut down, make disappear, destroy evil, etc. All right, and every week I like to cover what's happening in Best of 1. We have seen less innovation happening in Best of 1 than we have in Best of 3. So this week I'm going to kind of keep it really focused to the top performers. And number 1 on Untapped, which is a site that tracks Magic the Gathering data, with at least 1,000 matches, this week goes to Mono Red Aggro, which has been in the top 5 every single week. And so if we compare this one to the one that I covered in week 7 of Lost Caverns of Ixalan, we can see that we've ditched 2 copies of Bloodthirsty Adversary. These have been kind of, as I've been watching the decks change throughout the weeks, there seems to be a fluctuation of like 4 copies of Bloodthirsty Adversary down to 0 and now to 2. So I think they're trying to find the perfect amount of the Bloodthirsty Adversary. And the downside with this card is that if you don't get to 5 lands, then it's strictly just like there's better 2-drops like Felden and Charming Scoundrel and whatnot, right? So Bloodthirsty Adversary, though, allows you to loop your spells. If you do pay it for 5, then it comes down as a 3/3 haste and allows you to replay like a Lightning Strike or play with fire. So it can be really good. And I've talked about how, like, Bloodthirsty Adversary wants to run the Nahiri's Warcrafting over the Witchstalker's Frenzy. And I do think that, like, I stand by that statement if you're going to be doing that. This one is deciding not to run any. So we don't have the... so we have -2 on the Bloodthirsty Adversary, and in replacement for it, we have +2 on the Charming Scoundrel. And I like that. I think that, like, Charming Scoundrel, the downside to Charming Scoundrel is if they play, like, Cut Down on it. And in Best of 1, there's not a whole lot of black. And so you don't really get punished by just having a 2/2 that deals 1 damage when it dies, which I like more than the Bloodthirsty Adversary. Or sometimes you're missing that 3rd land and you need to create a treasure token so that you can guarantee that Squeeze coming into play, and it triggers Godric. So I think that there's more synergies in the Charming Scoundrel rather than just raw power of the Bloodthirsty Adversary on 5. And as you will see, there's debates as well about the how many lands to play in each deck. So no copies of Witchstalker Frenzy, no copies of Nahiri's Warcrafting, so less of the Bloodthirsty Adversary removal loop package in the first place. 1 less copy of Sokenzan, the legendary land, which helps trigger the celebration on Godric, and upping 1 more copy of the Mountains. And compared to the one in week 7 went all the way down to 20 lands. And because you are going to be running the Bloodthirsty Adversaries as a 2-of and Shivan Devastator, which scale well to drawing more lands, deciding to run 2 Mishra's Foundry because it's nice against the Azorius control decks to have some sort of alternative win condition, and against Domain, even in any deck running Sunfall. If you weren't able to close out the game, being able to get damage in with your Mishra's Foundries has been useful, turn 5 and onward. Here's one that did me joy. So number 2 this week with 1,000 matches on Untapped was Mono Red Burn. And this one, I've been wanting to try it out, and after running the 50 matches with Azorius Control, this one does better against the control lists than the other one, because the Mechanized Warfare, unless they have the Get Lost, allows you to just get more damage in that is less dependent on the board state. You have more direct damage through in the festivities than you do in the typical best of one list. The typical mono aggro list. And so I've covered this one. I thought this was going to be really well positioned because of the Red God. And I do think you could get away with playing the Red God over Sulfim if you wanted to. It's kind of doing a similar thing, but I think Sulfim's better. But so Sulfim, if a source you control would deal non-combat damage to an opponent or a permanent opponent controls, it deals double that damage to that player or permanent instead. And so it's doing a very similar thing that the Red God is doing, which is just making your non-combat damage better. And so one of the Red God from Lost Caverns of Ixalan, I think, could be kind of fun as well. Just an idea if you don't have Sulfim. But this list I covered all the way back in week 10 of Wilds of Eldraine. And we see a couple of changes. So one of which is Chandra dressed to kill. Bringing in a Planeswalker kind of showcases just how much board wipes there are even in best of one. And this allows you to dodge your opponent's Sunfalls and Wraths in general, and kind of gives you that a little bit more of that mid-range reach too, being able to draw additional cards or ramp to a little bit higher mana. If you have so Mechanized Warfare is kind of the card that like this whole strategy is centered around. If a red or artifact source you control would deal damage, it deals that damage +1 instead, and they do stack. So makes your in festivities hits for 2, which can be really good against the board strategies. Makes Chandra hit for 1. I never really get Chandra up high enough to do the ultimate, but technically it is an option. And then 2 less copies of Voldaren Epicure, which I thought was kind of interesting to see because I thought Voldaren Epicure was pretty nice to solve the flood. So when you flood out and you have too much mana, being able to sacrifice your blood tokens to then draw, in theory sounds good. When I've played the deck, I do feel like if you end up doing that, you kind of are already down a bad path. The functional space for this deck is pretty slim, so it doesn't have a lot of wiggle room from working or not working. So down 2 copies of Voldaren Epicure, I can get behind. Down 1 copy of Squee to 2 copies, and we're not really doing the go wide strategy of Squee. Squee's more in here for some inevitability against the mill, like Azorius Mill, or if you're not able to get enough damage early, then you don't have enough damage to actually finish. So Squee can be kind of this nice recurring threat. And then we got rid of the 2 copies of Mishra's Foundry, which I like. Anytime that you're like under 22 lands, you start really paying a price for having colorless lands in your deck. And so this one is just like, all right, no nonsense. We're not doing Mishra's Foundry. We're not even doing Sokenzan, which I think you could get away with. I think you could do 1 copy of the Sokenzan, because why not? It's free, right? But you're not really winning by going wide in the deck, so it's an unnecessary inclusion. But if you have it, whatever. It's better than a mountain, right? And bringing the lands up to 21. So I like playing this deck. I think it's just like in an enjoyable deck to play. It's never it peaks occasionally into tier 1 and then like fades away back down into tier 2 or tier 3. And right now I think it's well positioned because of how much Azorius control there is. And I do think if you like the mono red strategy, this one works better against the Azorius control deck than the typical aggro deck. And last but not least, we have mono white humans, which was number 3. And compared to week 8 of Lost Caverns of Ixalan, which was another way of saying last week, there's some changes, which I thought was kind of interesting. So we're down 3 copies of Skrelv, the Defector Might, so just ditching that entirely, which I kind of like, because if your opponent's playing Wraths instead of point removal, then Skrelv's kind of pointless. And instead we're including 3 copies of Warden of the Inner Sky. And I thought it's just a better threat than Skrelv. And it's a human, it has human synergies, it allows you to scry and smooth your draws early on in the game. Although I think a mistake that some people make is tapping instead of getting in for early damage. But it's definitely circumstance specific. And then down 4 copies of the Intrepid Adversary, which I like. I think the Intrepid Adversaries were kind of unnecessary. The mono white list has done well against the mono red list in the first place, right? So I think the Intrepid Adversary was kind of unnecessary life gain with a deck that was already doing pretty well against that matchup. So down 4 copies there, and up 4 copies of the Sanguine Evangelist. And I like this change. So one of the things that I was talking about briefly when I played the Azorius Mill deck was how Boros Tokens was problematic because Sanguine Evangelist needed to just be answered by like a Wrath. And so I think that this kind of reflects a little bit more of targeting Azorius control and a little bit of a downtick in mono red. So if we see like an uptick in mono red, we'll probably see the Intrepid Adversaries come back. But for the time being, I think that this is I'd rather have the Evangelist against control than I would against or than the Intrepid Adversary against that matchup specifically. And then we've also gone down 1 Virtue of Loyalty, and to tweak up the lands just slightly, so running a total of 23, we're down up 3 copies of Mishra's Foundry, which is another signpost that this deck was tweaked to be a little bit better against the Azorius control matchup, and up 1 copy of Agonjo. So now we're running 2 copies of Agonjo, which I like because there's a lot of legendary synergies. You've got Adeline and Thalia, so a lot of times your Agonjo is cheaper to play. And then just down 3 basic lands. So remember to hit like and subscribe if you like this sort of thing. I do a weekly meta review every Sunday, and I also put up a poll. So if you're new here, look at my community tab. I will be putting up a poll for the next 50 match summary. And so this week it will be a little bit more limited. Usually I try to put 4. This week is just going to be 3. But yeah, I really think that they did a good job with Standard for, Standard is in the RCQ rotation right now, and it's such a good sign to see 2 new archetypes in best of 3 in week 9 of a format. Like, it's just a really good sign that, like, not only are there's not just a single deck that's always being talked about every single week, but you're also seeing innovation on top of it. So I think the Standard meta, at least in best of 3, is in a really healthy place. And I think in best of 1, you have the typical hand smoother problems, which is just going to make your board flood and your aggro strategies a little bit more powerful than other options. But like, even best of 1 I've enjoyed, and it doesn't feel like it's just 90% mono red like it did maybe a few months ago. So take care, everybody, and maybe I'll see you on the ladder.